There's a specific kind of betrayal that hits different on screen, not the loud, villain cackling kind, but the quiet, everyday kind where the person who's supposed to run toward you just doesn't. And Brides in Smoke builds its whole emotional engine around that exact moment. Because tell me you wouldn't lose your mind watching a firefighter husband ignore his wife trapped in a burning room, so he can go look for his ex's cat. That's not just drama. That's a values test, live on camera, with firelight flickering on everyone's faces. Welcome back to Bongo Gaming, and yeah, today we're talking about the 2026 melodrama that absolutely weaponizes marriage vows, loyalty, and a very specific brand of male audacity. If you like these long, story-driven reviews, hit subscribe, no pressure, just if you keep coming back. And for spoilers, I'm keeping it light. We're going to talk about the setup, the emotional turns you basically meet in the premise, and how the show handles its biggest early gut punch, but I'm not going to go digging for endgame specifics or, here's exactly how it ends, stuff. Brides in Smoke is built around two best friends, Ella and Leah, who marry into the same family, two Harper brothers. One is Charles, a firefighter, the other is Noah, a doctor. On paper, that's a glossy fantasy setup, two women, two brothers, one intertwined family, sisterhood locked in, double dates forever. And then the show says, actually, what if the thing tying these women together isn't cute couple photos but mutual survival? What if their marriages aren't romances, they are slow erasures? The premise is so clean it almost dares you to underestimate it. Third anniversary. A first love from Charles' past shows up, and instead of being a petty ex-girlfriend trope who just lurks in doorways and smirks, she commits an act that is immediately, unmistakably violent. She locks Ella inside a burning room. That's not metaphorical. That's not emotional flames. That's fire. That's a door you can't open. That's oxygen thinning out while somebody decides what you're worth. And here's the part where the show either makes you throw your remote or lean in so hard you forget to blink. Ella begs Charles for help, and he brushes her off to go find his ex's cat. The first time you hear that sentence, it almost sounds like a satire pitch. Like, surely this is a miscommunication, surely he doesn't understand. No. The cruelty is that he does understand enough to choose wrong anyway. The show isn't subtle about it, and honestly, good. Because some choices don't deserve soft lighting. Now if you're already thinking, okay, that's too much, that's ridiculous, stay with me, because the way Brides in Smoke frames this moment is not as a one-off shock stunt. It's the thesis statement. It's saying, these women are not safe in these marriages, not because their husbands are cartoon villains twirling mustaches, but because the husband's priorities are corrupted in a way that's disturbingly believable. And the fire just makes it visible. Let me linger on the craft of that central moment for a second, because this is where the show's direction, at least in the way it's implied by the premise, has to do heavy lifting. A burning room sequence can be cheap chaos, all frantic cuts and screaming. But the best versions of this kind of scene don't just show danger, they show abandonment. You want the camera to make you feel time stretching, the sound narrowing down to breath and crackle, the world shrinking to a doorknob that won't turn and a voice outside that should be panicking, but isn't. The most haunting choice a director can make there is not loudness, it's hesitation. Silence. The horrible calm of someone deciding, in real time, that you are second. Here's a question that kept gnawing at me even from just the setup: why would a show choose to make a firefighter, the literal symbol of, I run into danger, be the man who walks away? Because that's not random. That's a deliberate inversion. It's the show saying the uniform doesn't matter if the heart is compromised. And I kind of respect the nerve of that, because it's easy to make a villain out of a guy whose job already feels morally dubious. It's harder to take a hero job and show how personal loyalty can rot behind it. And then Leah rushes in. Not a husband. Not the trained rescuer. The best friend. The sister by choice. Leah goes in to save Ella, and that right there is the story's real love story, even if the drama is technically about marriages and divorce. Brides in Smoke is basically asking, who actually shows up for you when it's not convenient? Who becomes brave when there's nothing to gain? Leah calling Noah, Dr. Husband, supposedly rational, supposedly caring, supposedly oath-bound to preserve life, should be the moment the men redeem themselves. It should be the pivot where they become worthy. Instead, she's met with mockery. Mockery. Not disbelief, not "I can't get there," not "tell me where you are," but ridicule in a moment where Ella and her baby need medical help. That's the kind of writing choice that makes you sit back and go, okay, so the show is not interested in giving these men, but he had trauma, excuses right now. It's interested in consequences. And before anyone says, this sounds like it's just misery, let me be fair, misery stories can be lazy. They can stack suffering like it's currency and call it depth. But there's a difference between suffering used for shock and suffering used as a spotlight. This premise, at least, isn't just, look how awful everything is. It's, look how clearly people reveal themselves under pressure. Fire doesn't create who you are. It shows who you are. Every time I explain this setup out loud, I can feel the invisible comment section forming. Why didn't Ella leave earlier? Why would Leah stay? Why marry brothers? And to me, that's where Brides in Smoke gets interesting, because it's not just about the one catastrophic anniversary night. The premise tells you these are years of miserable marriages. That means the show is playing in the slow burn space of emotional attrition, where you don't leave because one thing happens, you leave because 100 small things have taught you you're alone. There's something almost wickedly effective about placing the inciting betrayal on an anniversary. Anniversaries are supposed to be relationship propaganda. They are the day you post the smiling picture. Rewrite the year into something survivable, pretend the rough patches were growth. So to take that date and turn it into a near-death abandonment? That's the show spitting directly into the scrapbook. And since we're doing light spoilers, I'll stay anchored to what the premise gives us. The aftermath is heartbreak, betrayal, and then the decision, together, to file for divorce from the Harper brothers. Together is the key word. This isn't one woman escaping while the other stays and makes excuses. The friendship is structured as a joint awakening. It's basically a pact. If you jump, I jump. If you fight, I fight. If you're done pretending, I'm done too. Here's where I'll give you a slightly contrarian take, because I know some people are going to roll their eyes at the best friends divorcing brothers together thing and call it convenient or overly neat. But I actually think that symmetry can be powerful, because it denies the men the usual divide and conquer dynamic. So often, in stories like this, one woman gets painted as strong, and the other as weak, and the men exploit that split. A synchronized exit is a narrative way of saying, you don't get to isolate us. You don't get to make one of us the cautionary tale. Still, the show is walking a tightrope. When you make betrayal this extreme, burning room, dismissal, mockery, you risk flattening the men into pure monsters, and then the divorce choice becomes less of an emotional journey and more of a no-brainer. The interesting version of Brides in Smoke is the one that still makes the leaving hard, not because the husbands deserve mercy, but because disentangling your life from someone can feel like tearing off your own skin even when they are wrong. And the premise hints at exactly that, years of miserable marriages. Years means routines. Habits. Shared homes. Family expectations. The Harper name. Social image. The kind of entanglement where you can be furious and still feel trapped by what you built. So the tension isn't, will they leave? It's, how will they reclaim themselves without losing each other in the process? If the show is smart, and the setup suggests it wants to be, Ella and Leah won't just be victims who get rescued and then file paperwork. They'll be people who have learned to doubt their own perceptions. Because when a man who is supposed to love you watches you burn, your brain doesn't just register betrayal, it starts rewriting your self-worth. And when a doctor mocks your fear, you don't just get angry, you start wondering if you're dramatic, if you overreact, if you're the problem. That's what emotional cruelty does, it colonizes your inner voice. Let me talk about Ella for a second, because the burning room scenario puts her in a position where the acting, if it's done well, can be brutal to watch in the best way. You need more than screaming. You need the shift from confusion to realization. The moment she understands Charles is choosing the cat. That's the moment that should land like a punch. It's not even the fire that breaks you, it's the look in your husband's eyes when he decides you're not urgent. An actor can do a lot with a small flicker there, the chin tremble, the swallowing of disbelief, The voice trying to stay polite because women are trained to stay palatable even while dying. If the performance goes there, it's unforgettable. And then Leah is the kind of character that can become sanctified too easily. The perfect best friend who does everything right. I'm hoping Brides in Smoke gives her texture beyond bravery. Because running into a burning space for someone is heroic, sure. But what about the resentment afterward? What about the terror that hits later, when adrenaline leaves and you realize you could have died because two men didn't care enough? What about the anger at Ella for staying with Charles in the first place, even if that anger is unfair? Real friendships survive not because they are pure, but because they can handle messy truth. Now I want to zoom out and talk pacing, because a lot of dramas with a high-octane inciting incident struggle afterward. They blow their emotional budget early, and then everything that follows has to compete with "remember when she was literally locked in a burning room?" That's a hard act to follow. The way you solve that is by making the aftermath not quieter, but sharper. The fire is physical, the divorce is psychological warfare. If the show slows down after the fire, it can't just meander. It needs scenes that cut, conversations where people say the wrong thing with absolute confidence. Family members minimizing it. The husbands rewriting history. The wives realizing their memories have been edited by years of gaslighting. And yes, I'm using the word gaslighting carefully here. I'm not saying every bad husband is a gaslighter. I'm saying the premise literally gives us dismissal and mockery in moments of danger, which is not just cruelty, it's a kind of reality denial. You're not in danger, you're not worth urgency, you're ridiculous. That's the kind of behavior that, over time, trains a person to stop trusting their own fear signals. That's the horror underneath the melodrama. There's also a class and status subtext sitting in the background that the show could either explore beautifully or ignore completely. Firefighter. Doctor. Those are respectable, socially shielded professions. People assume goodness from them. So when those men fail morally, the women may not be believed. Or they may be told, he saves lives, as if that cancels out what he did at home. That's such a real-world dynamic it almost hurts. And if Brides in Smoke leans into that, how society excuses public heroes for private harm, that's where it can become more than just a revenge divorce fantasy. Okay, quick self-aware aside, the cat detail is so specific it almost feels like the writer had an agenda. Like somebody in that writer's room once lost an argument to a man who said, "But my cat," and they've been waiting years to put it in a script. And honestly? Respect. Pet lovers, don't come for me. I love animals. That's not the point. The point is the hierarchy of care. The point is that the cat becomes a symbol for anything but you. And this is where sound design matters more than people think. In a burning room sequence, the sound team can make the fire feel like a living thing, this constant hungry roar under everything, like the world is chewing. But if they are really on their game, they'll let you hear the moment Ella realizes she's alone. The ringing in the ears. The sudden drop in the mix where her voice sounds far away even to herself. And outside that door, Charles' voice, if we hear it, should be absurdly normal. That normalness is what makes abandonment horrifying. Not the scream. The casualness. I'm also curious how the show visually differentiates the two marriages. Because you've got parallel relationships, Ella with Charles, Leah with Noah. The easy, lazy route is to paint them with the same brush, both husbands bad. The more interesting route is to show different flavors of betrayal. Charles' betrayal is action-based, he fails to rescue. Noah's is emotional intellectual, he mocks, dismisses, perhaps uses his authority as a doctor to belittle Leah's urgency. If the cinematography reflects that, Charles' world shot with urgency and chaos, Noah's with cold, clinical distance, that could be really smart storytelling without needing extra plot. The friendship between Ella and Leah, though, is the heart. And I'm saying that not as a cliché, but because the premise structurally positions Leah as Ella's lifeline and Ella as Leah's mirror. They are not just allies, they are witnesses. And witnesses are powerful in stories about emotional abuse, because abuse thrives in private. The second someone else sees it, the spell starts to crack. Leah seeing Charles choose the cat is not just a plot event, it's a rupture in the narrative the marriages have been telling. Here's another rehook that I think matters. What does it do to Ella to be rescued by Leah instead of Charles? Because that changes the emotional math permanently. Gratitude can become guilt. Dependence can become resentment. And a lot of dramas are afraid of that complexity. They want the friendship to be pure sunlight. But the truth is, being saved can feel humiliating when the person who should have saved you chose not to. If the show lets Ella feel that, even for a moment, it becomes so much more human. Performance-wise, I'm going to talk in hypotheticals because I'm not here to invent scenes that weren't given to me, but the premise demands certain acting choices to sell it. For Charles, the actor has to thread a needle. If he plays it as obvious evil, it's boring. If he plays it as sincere confusion, like he genuinely doesn't register the severity, then it becomes a different kind of horror, incompetence as danger. The most chilling version is probably somewhere in between. He knows, but he rationalizes. He convinces himself he'll come back in time. He tells himself Ella is exaggerating. He tells himself the ex's cat is helpless. The actor's face in that rationalization moment matters more than any dialogue. Noah's mockery is also a big acting test, because mocking someone who is begging for medical help is a line that can tip into cartoon territory if it's played too big. The best way to do it is small. A half laugh. A smirk that vanishes when challenged. That little dismissive exhale. The kind of cruelty that's socially deniable. The kind where later he can say, "I wasn't mocking you," and you're left feeling crazy because you can't prove tone. Now, I want to be honest about my personal reaction here, because this is one of those premises that pokes at a very specific nerve. I've watched a lot of dramas where women are endangered to motivate plot, and sometimes I feel manipulated, like the show is daring me to care by escalating harm. But with Brides in Smoke, the betrayal is so pointed, so morally legible, that it didn't make me numb. It made me angry in a way that felt clarifying. I didn't feel like the show was saying, "Watch her suffer." It felt like it was saying, "Watch them choose." And that distinction matters to me. The divorce decision, made together, is where the show's emotional pacing can either sing or stumble. Because divorce in dramas can be treated like a MIC drop line, "I want a divorce." And then we move on. But in real life, and in good melodrama, divorce is not one scene. It's 1,000 tiny separations. It's sleeping arrangements. It's paperwork. It's family backlash. It's memories turning sour. It's the weird grief of losing the person you thought you married, even when the person you actually married is sitting right there acting offended. And the Harper brothers dynamic, two brothers married to best friends, adds an extra layer of pressure. Because it's not just leaving a man, it's potentially detonating a whole family structure. Every holiday becomes a battlefield. Every mutual friend becomes a judge. That kind of social entanglement can trap people longer than love ever did. So if the show explores that, it can create tension without needing new, big shocks. The shock already happened. Now we live in the fallout. Let's talk tone. Brides in Smoke, even from its premise, reads like heightened melodrama, bold choices, big betrayal, life or death stakes. Some viewers bounce off that because they want realism, subtlety. People don't act like this. But I'm going to defend heightened melodrama when it has emotional truth. Because even if the literal event, locked in a burning room by a first love, is extreme, the emotional event is not. People do feel deprioritized. People do get dismissed in emergencies. People do realize, in a single moment, that the person next to them will not choose them. The show is taking the common emotional experience and putting it in a pressure cooker so you can't ignore it. And if you're a newcomer to this kind of drama, here's what I'd say: don't watch it like a documentary. Watch it like a fable with sharp teeth. The fire is fire, yes, but it's also a visual translation of, "I am in danger and you don't care." The cat is a cat, yes, but it's also, anything is more important than you. The mockery is mockery, yes, but it's also, your fear is inconvenient to me. Now, what bothered me a little, even as someone who is fully willing to go along for the ride, is that the premise risks making the ex, Charles' first love, the designated villain in a way that could let the men off the hook emotionally. Because it's very easy for an audience to go, well, the ex is crazy, and focus all the rage on her, and then Charles becomes a guy who was manipulated instead of a guy who failed. The show needs to keep the moral spotlight where it belongs, on the husband who chose wrong, and on the doctor who mocked. The ex can be a catalyst, but she shouldn't become the excuse. That said, I also don't want the ex to be flattened into evil woman, because that's a tired trope too. The premise gives us a heinous act, so accountability is non-negotiable, but from a writing standpoint, the most interesting antagonists believe they are justified. They have a story in their head where they are the injured party. If Brides in Smoke gives even a glimpse of that self-justification, without asking us to sympathize with the harm, it can make the conflict feel more psychologically real. Monsters who think they're angels are always more believable than monsters who know they are monsters. Here's another thing I'm watching for in the show's execution, how it handles pregnancy and bodily stakes without turning Ella into a vessel. The premise mentions Ella and her baby needing saving. That can be emotionally devastating when done with care, because it raises the stakes beyond Ella's own life. But it can also slide into using the baby as a plot coupon, now it matters. I want the show to treat Ella as worth saving even without motherhood. And the way you do that is simple, you frame her fear, her agency, her voice, not just the pregnancy. The editing rhythm around the rescue moment is also crucial. Good editing can make you feel like you're running with Leah, close shots, breathy handheld, the camera slightly unstable like your own body is panicking. Bad editing turns it into an action montage where the emotion gets lost in the mechanics. If Brides in Smoke leans into Leah's point of view, letting us feel her decision, her split-second choice to go in when she shouldn't have to, that's where the sisterhood becomes visceral, not just stated. I keep coming back to the title, too, because Brides in Smoke is such a loaded phrase. Smoke is what lingers. Fire is the event, smoke is the aftermath that gets into your clothes, your hair, your lungs. Smoke is what you're still coughing up days later. If the show understands that, then it won't treat the anniversary night as the only big scene. It'll treat it as the beginning of contamination, everything afterward is tinted by it. Also, I have to laugh a little at the irony of Harper Brothers. A firefighter and a doctor named Harper feels like destiny is begging them to be the good guys. Like the universe cast them as saviors. And then they just don't. That cognitive dissonance is the point, I know, but it's also why the show can be so rage-inducing. You want to believe in them. You want the job titles to mean something. The drama comes from watching the illusion crumble. If I were to critique the premise purely as a structure, I'd say the biggest challenge is sustainability. How does the show maintain tension once the women decide to divorce? Because once you've crossed that threshold, the story can't just be, they are divorcing, 4 hours. It has to become about transformation. What does freedom cost? What do they lose socially, financially, emotionally? Do they feel relief, or do they feel emptiness? Do they miss the men, or do they miss the dream? Those are the questions that keep a divorce narrative from becoming repetitive. And here's where Leah's call to Noah can become a recurring motif, even if we don't get repeated emergency scenes. The idea of reaching out for help and being mocked can echo in quieter moments, Leah hesitating before speaking up, second-guessing herself, apologizing when she's right. If the show tracks that kind of psychological residue, it becomes richer without needing bigger explosions. Let's sit with Charles specifically for a beat, because I can already hear the defenses people might raise. Maybe he thought Ella was safe. Maybe he didn't know it was that bad. The premise says Ella begged him for help. That's the line in the sand. When someone you love is begging, you don't get to hide behind uncertainty. You move. The tragedy is that he doesn't. And I think Brides in Smoke is deliberately interrogating that male tendency to treat women's urgency as noise, something to be managed, not answered. You know what's quietly brilliant about choosing a firefighter for this betrayal? Firefighters are trained to assess risk, to prioritize rescue, to act fast. So when Charles doesn't, it reads less like panic and more like preference. It's like his instincts work fine, just not for her. That's the knife twist. Now Noah. Doctors carry authority like armor. In dramas, doctors can be gentle healers or cold gods. The premise gives us mockery, and that word is so telling because it implies contempt, not just negligence. Contempt is relationship poison. Contempt is the moment love turns into superiority. If Noah's default mode is to belittle Leah, then the marriage isn't just unhappy, it's structurally unsafe for her sense of self. There's a really interesting interplay here, too, between public service and private failure. Both men have jobs where they are, theoretically, responsible for other people's lives. So what does it say that they don't extend that responsibility to the women closest to them? It suggests a compartmentalizer, and that is deeply human and deeply alarming. I can be good out there, and cruel in here. And the show seems to want to drag that hypocrisy into daylight. Okay, let me paint the mini-scene as it lives in my head based on the premise, because this is the image that sells the whole drama. Ella is inside a room that's gone from warm to suffocating. The air looks dirty. Smoke threads through the light like grey ribbons. The door handle is hot enough to burn skin. Her voice is wrecked from calling out. Outside, footsteps, hope. She hears Charles. That split second where her whole body believes she's about to be saved. And then the words land wrong. Not, where are you, not, hold on, but something about the ex's cat. Something casual. Something like, just wait. And Ella's face changes. Not into screaming, into comprehension. Like her soul sits down because it realizes it's been standing alone for years. And then Leah. Leah isn't wearing a uniform. She doesn't have permission. She just has love and adrenaline and terror. She runs toward the heat anyway. And even if we don't see every detail, the emotional picture is clear. The friend becomes the rescuer while the husband becomes background noise. That reversal is the scene's whole point. If that scene is shot with clarity, close enough to feel intimate, not so chaotic that you lose emotional orientation, it's the kind of moment that sticks with viewers for a long time. The show will live or die on whether it earns that stickiness. Now, because we're keeping spoilers light, I'm not going to claim specific later confrontations or legal battles. But I can talk about what the setup promises in terms of relationship dynamics. Once two women decide to divorce two brothers together, the men are likely to respond not just as individuals but as a unit. Brothers can become a team. They can reinforce each other's narratives. We're the good guys, they are overreacting. And that's terrifying because it becomes a two-on-two emotional courtroom where the women have to stay aligned to survive it. And that alignment is not automatic. Best friends can disagree on strategy. One can want to scorch the earth, the other can want peace. One can still feel love, the other can feel only disgust. The healthiest thing Brides in Smoke can do is allow Ella and Leah to be different. Sisterhood isn't interesting when it's identical, it's interesting when it's chosen despite difference. The show also has a chance to explore shame, which is the emotion most dramas rush past. Being betrayed publicly, or in a way that could become public, creates a specific kind of humiliation. Imagine telling people your firefighter husband ignored you in a fire. People will ask questions you don't want to answer. People will look at you like you're pathetic, even though you're the victim. Shame makes people stay quiet. And silence is how misery lasts years. One more thing about the title and imagery, smoke also blurs vision. It makes it hard to see what's right in front of you. That's a neat metaphor for marriage denial. You can be in a relationship where the signs are everywhere: dismissal, contempt, neglect, but you can't see clearly because you're living inside the haze. It takes a crisis to clear it. Or to make it so thick you can't breathe anymore. And yes, I'm aware I'm talking like I'm already emotionally invested. I am. I'm a sucker for women choosing themselves, especially when the story doesn't make it cute. I don't need boss babe edits. I need the ugly crying, the doubt, the shaking hand signing papers, the friend holding your shoulders while you try not to call him back. That's the stuff that feels earned. But let me check myself and be critical, because a mixed stance means I'm not just here to cheer. The risk with Brides in Smoke is that it could become a misery parade that never allows joy. And joy matters because joy is what makes freedom feel real. If every scene is suffering and confrontation, the audience can get exhausted. The show needs breathing room, moments where Ella and Leah remember who they were before these men, moments where their friendship isn't just triage but actually life-giving. Also, the men being a firefighter and a doctor could tempt the writers into using their jobs as plot devices constantly. I'd rather the show use those jobs symbolically and then focus on the relationships. Because at the end of the day, this isn't a procedural about fires and hospitals. It's about intimacy failure. The jobs should flavor the dynamic, not replace it. Let's talk about dialogue style for a second, because mockery can be written in a lot of ways. The cheap way is overt insults. The more realistic way is the kind of joking tone that pretends to be harmless. Are you serious? You're being dramatic. Calm down. Those three phrases have ended more relationships than any screaming match. If Brides in Smoke writes Noah with that kind of casual dismissal, it will feel painfully familiar to a lot of viewers. I'm also curious how the show frames the ex, Charles' first love, visually. Does she get harsh lighting, villain angles, ominous music? Or does she get normal lighting, normal framing, like she could be anyone? Because if you want the story to feel like a cautionary tale about priorities and moral choices, you don't want the antagonist to look like an antagonist. You want her to look like a person who walks into your life with a smile and then turns the temperature up when no one's looking. And music can either elevate this kind of melodrama or accidentally make it feel like a parody. A swelling violin while someone is literally coughing in smoke can feel manipulative if it's too on the nose. Sometimes the strongest choice is to let diegetic sound carry the scene, the crackle, the distant alarm, footsteps, a muffled shout. Then, when the emotional punch lands, when Ella realizes Charles is leaving, bring in a minimal motif, something that feels like dread creeping in rather than sadness being shoved down your throat. Here's a rehook for you. The most fascinating part of this premise isn't that the men fail, it's what they do after they fail. Because failure can be followed by remorse, denial, rage, or entitlement. And those responses reveal character more than the initial act. Do they apologize? Do they justify? Do they blame the women for being difficult? Do they try to buy forgiveness with gestures while refusing accountability? That's where the drama lives. If Brides in Smoke understands power, it will show how the Harper brothers might use their social credibility against the women. He's a firefighter. He's a doctor. They would never. That's a wall women smash themselves against all the time, and it's maddening. And if the show wants to be emotionally honest, it should let us feel that maddening stuckness before the divorce becomes possible. Another element I appreciate in the setup is that Leah doesn't just comfort Ella, she takes action. She rescues her. She calls Noah. She tries to mobilize help. That matters because it frames Leah as someone who believes urgency is valid. And that's the antidote to gaslighting, someone who treats your fear as information, not inconvenience. Now, the best friends filing for divorce together is such a strong, crowd-pleasing idea that I almost worry the show will rush to it too quickly and miss the messy middle. Because the decision to divorce is often preceded by a phase of bargaining. Maybe if we talk. Maybe if he explains. Maybe if he changes. Those phases aren't weakness, they are grief in motion. If Brides in Smoke lets Ella and Leah wobble a little before they stand, it'll feel more truthful. And yes, I'm aware that some viewers hate wobbling. People want empowerment instantly. They want the woman to walk out in heels and never look back. But I'm going to say something mildly unpopular: instant empowerment can be emotionally shallow. Real empowerment is slow. It's a muscle you rebuild. It's saying, I deserve better, on Monday and doubting yourself on Tuesday and saying it again on Wednesday anyway. Also, the two marriages being miserable for years raises the question of what kept them there. Love? Obligation? Fear? Family pressure? The fantasy of, if I try harder it'll get better? Those are all rich, painful motivations that dramas can explore without adding new plot events. You don't need a new villain every week if you understand the villain can be hope used as a cage. I want to circle back to the friendship again because it's the cleanest source of warmth in this premise. If the show does one thing right, It should be the little moments between Ella and Leah that show history, inside jokes, shared looks, the kind of shorthand best friends have where a single eyebrow raise is a whole conversation. Those tiny details make the big gestures, like rushing into a burning room, feel earned instead of scripted. And the show can do something visually beautiful with that, too. Frame the women in the same shot often, let them occupy space together, while the men are framed separately or partially, cut off by door frames, blocked by objects, always slightly removed. You can tell a whole story of emotional distance with blocking. If the director knows that, Brides in Smoke can be really effective even when the plot is simple. Because the plot is, in some ways, simple: betrayal, rescue, mockery, divorce decision. The complexity has to come from emotion and consequence, not from piling on twists. And I'm saying that as someone who enjoys a good twist, but I don't need it here. I need the show to stare at the betrayal long enough for it to mean something. One more personal confession: abandonment stories mess with me. Not in a "this is too dark" way, but in a I start mentally arguing with the screen way. I become that person yelling, "Why are you still talking to him?" And then I have to catch myself, because that's exactly what these stories are about: how leaving is obvious to outsiders and complicated to the person living it. If Brides in Smoke can make me feel that frustration and then make me understand it, that's good writing. Now, we haven't even gotten into the emotional symbolism of the baby in the premise. A baby represents future. It represents vulnerability. It represents a tie that can bind you to someone you want to leave. If Ella is pregnant or has a baby, either way, the show is putting motherhood into the divorce equation. That can raise the stakes but also complicate agency. The best version of this story lets Ella's desire to leave be about Ella, not just about protecting the child. Because women are allowed to leave because they are unhappy. Full stop. There's also an interesting moral contrast between Charles and Noah in terms of saving. Charles is supposed to save from fire. Noah is supposed to save from bodily harm. The women, meanwhile, end up saving each other. That's a thematic triangle that could be really satisfying if the show keeps echoing it in subtle ways: who saves whom, who refuses, who laughs, who runs in. And if you're sitting there wondering, is this show going to be too heavy? That depends on how it balances catharsis. Melodramas like this work when they let you feel rage and then give you movement, some forward momentum where choices have teeth. The decision to divorce is the first taste of that movement. What comes after, how the women execute that decision, how the men react, how the friendship holds, determines whether Brides in Smoke becomes addictive catharsis or just exhausting cruelty. I'll leave you with one more craft thing I'm hoping the show understands: the difference between forgiveness and accountability. A lot of dramas confuse the two and think a tearful apology is character growth. But accountability is action. Accountability is accepting consequences without bargaining. If the Harper brothers try to shortcut their way back into comfort, the show should not reward them just because they cry prettily. And if the show does reward them too easily, that's where I'll get sharp, because nothing ruins a betrayal story like asking the audience to forget what we watched. Alright, let's keep going, because there's still a lot to unpack in how this premise sets up not just a divorce story, but a story about identity, who you become when you stop being somebody's wife and start being your own person again. And what it means that Ella and Leah are doing it side by side when the world around them is probably going to try to pry them apart. Side by side when the world around them is probably going to try to pry them apart. Because that's the underrated threat in this setup: not just the husbands, not just the ex, not just the family name, but the slow social pressure that says, be reasonable. Be quiet. Don't ruin everything. And everything, in these stories, is usually code for everyone else's comfort. What I like about the premise is how bluntly it frames miserable marriages as the baseline. It doesn't romanticize the suffering. It doesn't tease you with, maybe it's just a misunderstanding. It says, these were bad for years, and then the universe lit a match and forced the truth into the open. That matters, because it shifts the goal from fix the marriage to fix the women's lives. A lot of dramas pretend those are the same mission. They are not. And when two women decide to leave two brothers, the story practically begs to explore how loyalty gets weaponized. Brothers have a built-in alliance. They grew up together. They've likely defended each other in every argument since childhood. Meanwhile, best friends choose each other, but that choice has to be renewed under stress. The show's tension isn't just romantic conflict, it's alliance pressure. Can Ella and Leah keep choosing each other when the Harper brothers inevitably push back, play victim, or, worse, play charming? Let me rehook you right here. The most dangerous version of Charles and Noah isn't the openly cruel version. It's the version where they act devastated and misunderstood, because that's what makes the women doubt themselves again. That's why I keep circling back to the concept of public face. Firefighter and doctor aren't just jobs, they are reputations. Those professions come with automatic credibility, like a halo you don't have to earn every day. So when Charles dismisses a wife trapped in a burning room, it's not just marital betrayal, it's a betrayal of the identity he sells to the world. And it forces Ella into a specific kind of social isolation. People will struggle to believe her, not because she's lying, but because believing her would mean admitting the halo was fake. Now, since I'm keeping spoilers light and staying within the premise, I can't tell you how the show handles that social layer. But the setup is basically screaming for it. Even a single dinner table conversation could carry that weight. Someone saying, "But Charles saves people," and Ella sitting there thinking, "He didn't save me." That's the emotional irony the show has already baked in. The other angle that's quietly potent is the idea of competence. Both Harper brothers are trained, competent men in high-stakes environments. Their failure at home, then, isn't because they're clueless. It reads like a choice. It reads like they can prioritize and act decisively when it benefits their identity, but when it comes to the women's needs, suddenly it's confusion, delay, dismissal. That kind of selective competence is a very specific kind of rage trigger for viewers, and I mean that as a compliment. It's a rage trigger because it's recognizable. And Ella begging Charles for help, again, I'm not inventing lines, I'm just taking the premise seriously, that implies she's reaching a level of desperation that bypasses pride. Begging is what you do when you've run out of tools. It's what you do when you've already tried reason and routine and patience and softening yourself into something manageable. So that one word, begs, is doing a ton of work. It tells you this isn't the first time she's asked him to show up. It's just the first time the consequence is flames. Here's a small but important craft thing: the show's emotional credibility depends on whether it portrays Ella and Leah as people with inner lives beyond the marriage. Because if they are written only as wives reacting to husbands, the story can become claustrophobic. But if the show gives them desires, humor, competence, messy contradictions, then the divorce isn't the end of a relationship, it's the return of a whole person. And yes, I'm saying that like it's easy. It's not. A lot of dramas in this lane fall into suffering equals depth. That's not true. Depth is choices. Depth is seeing a character do something you didn't expect but immediately believe. Depth is watching someone you assumed would collapse actually get practical, or someone you assumed would be tough actually break down in private. Brides in Smoke has a setup that could support that kind of dimensionality, if it uses the fire as a catalyst rather than a cage. Another rehook, because I can feel the topic wanting to drift into generalities. What does together really mean when they file for divorce together? Together can be solidarity, but it can also be dependency. It can be, we're strong, or it can be, I can't do this without you. And those are two different emotional stories. The premise leans hard into the bond between Ella and Leah, which I love, but it also sets up a possible pressure point. What if one friend moves faster than the other? What if one wants to confront, the other wants to disappear? What if one wants to keep the family peace, and the other wants to burn the whole Harper image down to ash? Those differences are where friendship stories become honest. I also want to talk about the ex, Charles' first love, with a little nuance again. Locking someone in a burning room is extreme, and I'm not here to soften that. But I've seen too many dramas use the evil ex as a scapegoat while the husband gets to play confused. The premise doesn't allow that if you're watching with your eyes open. Because even if the ex started the fire scenario, Charles is still responsible for what he does with the information he has in that moment. Ella begs him. He chooses something else. That's on him. The ex is not the moral center. Charles is, because he's the spouse. And I'll be real, I'm already bracing for the way some viewers will try to twist this into women fighting each other, rather than men failing their vows. It happens every time. People will focus on the ex's wrongdoing and turn the conversation into a catfight narrative. The stronger, more uncomfortable narrative is actually about male allegiance, to past love, to ego, to reputation, outweighing present responsibility. Now, the doctor husband, Noah, mocking Leah when she calls for help, is such a chilling detail because it shows emotional violence in a socially acceptable packaging. Doctors, in fiction, often get to be brisk or condescending, and it's played as he's stressed or he's analytical. But mockery is not analysis. Mockery is contempt. And contempt is the thing that makes a marriage feel like a courtroom where you're always on trial. If the actor playing Noah nails that with subtlety, like a half-second smile that doesn't reach the eyes, a tiny laugh that feels like a slap, that's the kind of performance detail that viewers remember. It's not about shouting. It's about tone. The way the body leans back like, really? The way the eyes flick away like your panic is boring. Those micro-choices are where the character becomes infuriatingly real. Here's my slightly surprising take, and I'll defend it. The premise being too extreme might actually help some viewers understand the emotional truth more clearly. Because when emotional neglect is portrayed in everyday domestic scenes, people can rationalize it away. Maybe he had a bad day. Maybe she's sensitive. But when you put that neglect next to literal flames, the audience can't pretend it's a minor issue. The show is basically translating invisible harm into visible danger. That's melodrama doing what it does best, making the intangible undeniable. Now, do I worry about tonal whiplash? Yeah. Because if a show opens with an attempted murder-level incident and then settles into paperwork and conversations, the energy can dip. But the good news is, divorce is not inherently low stakes. Divorce is a battlefield of identity, money, social networks, and memory. It's not calm. It's a different kind of heat. If Brides in Smoke treats the divorce decision like the start of a war for selfhood, the pacing can stay tight without needing another literal fire. Also, Brides in Smoke, as a concept, suggests aftermath, and aftermath is where good acting lives. Trauma isn't only in the crisis, it's in the mundane moment later when someone flinches at a smell, or can't breathe in a small room, or hears a siren and freezes. Again, I'm not claiming the show definitely includes those beats, I'm saying the premise is positioned to make those beats feel organic if the writers choose to go there. Let me be emotionally transparent for a second. The detail that Leah runs in to rescue Ella hit me harder than the husband's betrayal, even though the betrayal is the headline. Because there's something incredibly moving about a friendship being the strongest bond in the room. I've had friendships where you can feel, in your bones, that person would show up. And I've also seen relationships where the person who promised to show up, didn't. Stories like this press on that bruise. And yes, I also laughed, darkly, at the cat thing. Not because it's funny in world, but because it's such a brutally clear metaphor for misprioritization that it almost reads like the writers daring you to accept it. Like, are you really going to keep defending him after this? It's a narrative dare, and it's effective. Here's a rehook that keeps the story engine running. If the women are filing for divorce together, what happens when the men realize they can't isolate one wife from the other? Do they escalate? Do they charm? Do they blame? Do they beg? The strategy shift is where the drama can turn from shock to psychology. From a cinematography standpoint, I'd love if the show leans into contrast, the warm glow of anniversary expectations, soft lights, celebratory decor, versus the harsh, dirty light of smoke and emergency. Even if the show isn't visually prestige, a smart use of color temperature can do a lot. Warmth becomes a lie. Coolness becomes clarity. Smoke becomes the filter that finally lifts. Editing can also underline that. Anniversary moments, if shown, could be shot with smoother pacing, longer takes, a sense of, we're pretending. Then the crisis hits and the cuts tighten, handheld shakes, the world loses stability. And after the crisis, the show could return to longer takes again, but now those long takes aren't romantic, they're uncomfortable. They force you to sit with the aftermath. That's a great way to use form to reflect emotion. Music-wise, I already mentioned the danger of overscoring. But there's another trick good melodramas use: they associate a motif with the lie, not the love. So a romantic theme might play early, but later it returns in a minor key, twisted, like a memory turned toxic. If Brides in Smoke does that, if the anniversary vibe becomes haunting rather than sweet, that's an easy win for emotional storytelling. Now, because we only have a premise, I'm going to be careful not to invent scenes. But I can still talk about character arcs that are implied by the setup. Ella's arc, from what we're given, is likely about believing herself again. When you're dismissed in crisis, you don't just lose faith in your partner, you lose faith in your ability to judge people. You start thinking, how did I marry someone who would do that? That spiral can lead to self-blame, which is the trap. The healthier arc is self-recognition: I didn't deserve this. I'm not stupid. I was manipulated, minimized, trained to accept less. Leah's arc might be about boundaries and anger. Because rescuers, especially in female friendships, can become habitual self-sacrificers. Leah runs in. Leah calls. Leah acts. But at some point, Leah has to ask, where am I in my own life? If the show is honest, Leah's heroism will come with a cost. Not just physical risk, but emotional exhaustion. And watching her learn to prioritize herself as fiercely as she prioritizes Ella could be incredibly satisfying. The Harper brothers, if written with any nuance, will have arcs too, even if the show doesn't aim to redeem them. An arc doesn't have to be growth. It can be exposure. Charles' arc could be the unraveling of his hero identity. Noah's arc could be the unmasking of his superiority and entitlement. And if the show is brave, it won't give them a neat, I'm sorry, and call it done. It'll show how some men, when confronted, don't become better, they become more strategic. And that's why the divorce decision is such a strong pivot. Divorce is not just an ending, it's a threat to male comfort. For Charles and Noah, divorce isn't only, I lose my wife. It's, I lose the narrative. It's, people might see me differently. Especially for a firefighter and a doctor, that image threat can be more motivating than love, and that's bleak but real. Another rehook: the most compelling part of Brides in Smoke might end up being not the fire, but the moment the women stop arguing their case to men who are committed to misunderstanding them. Let's talk themes, because this premise is absolutely loaded. The biggest theme is choice under pressure. Fire makes choices immediate. But the show is also about slow choice, years of misery, years of swallowing words. The premise suggests these women didn't just let it happen, they survived it until they couldn't. That's an important distinction. Staying isn't always consent. Staying can be fear, conditioning, financial entanglement, hope, love, or just exhaustion. A good drama doesn't shame the women for staying, it shows the mechanisms that kept them there. Another theme is credibility. Who gets believed? Who gets mocked? Leah calls Noah, and he mocks her. That's not just personal cruelty, it's a dismissal of her authority over her own reality. And if the story expands that into the broader world, friends, family, colleagues, it becomes a social commentary without needing speeches. And then there's the theme of sisterhood as salvation. Leah literally saves Ella. That's direct, not symbolic. And their joint divorce decision is a second rescue, pulling each other out of marriages that have been burning, metaphorically, for years. The show's title invites that reading. Smoke is what you inhale in a fire, but it's also what you inhale in a toxic relationship. It's the thing you don't notice until you can't breathe. I also want to point out the gendered expectation embedded here. Charles is a firefighter, he is socially expected to be brave. Leah, as a woman and a friend, is not expected to run into flames. So when she does, it's not only heroism, it's a rejection of gendered scripts. Meanwhile, Charles' refusal is not only betrayal, it's a collapse of masculine role performance. Brides in Smoke is playing with those archetypes in a way that could be really biting if it stays intentional. Let me be critical again, because I don't want this to sound like I'm just praising potential. The premise risks melodramatic shorthand. Mockery can be a blunt instrument. Locked in a burning room can be shock bait. For the show to work, it needs emotional texture around those beats. It needs the kind of dialogue that feels like people, not plot. It needs quiet scenes where the women process what happened, not just react. If it jumps too quickly to "Divorce Squad, let's go," it might feel cathartic but hollow. But the fact that the premise emphasizes heartbroken and betrayed after years suggests it knows this isn't a single night issue. It's cumulative. That's encouraging. Another little craft note, the show can use physical space as emotional metaphor. The burning room is an obvious trap. But marriages can be traps too. If the show frames the Harper home, if there is one, as beautiful but suffocating, or shot through door frames and mirrors and tight corridors, it can create a visual echo of confinement without extra plot. Even simple blocking, like the husbands always standing between the wives and the exit during arguments, can communicate control. And because Leah and Ella are best friends, their scenes can be shot with openness, wider frames, more air, more windows, more outside light. That contrast between cramped marriage scenes and breathable friendship scenes would make the theme physical, not just verbal. Here's another rehook, because I want to keep the momentum. If the men are this dismissive in crisis, what does that imply about the years of miserable marriages? What kind of small daily humiliations led to this point? That's the shadow story behind the premise. I can't list those humiliations as facts, because we weren't given them. But the premise already tells us the flavor. Dismissal. Mockery. Prioritizing someone else, an ex, a cat, ego, over the wife's safety. Those behaviors don't appear overnight. They are habits. They are defaults. So the show has an opportunity to let viewers connect the big betrayal to the smaller ones that likely preceded it, the forgotten promises, the minimized feelings, the way a woman's fear is treated like drama. And that's why I think Brides in Smoke could resonate even with people who have never experienced anything as extreme as the premise. Because plenty of people know what it feels like to ask for help and get laughed at. Plenty of people know what it feels like to be in pain and be told you're exaggerating. The premise turns that emotional reality into a literal emergency, and that translation can be cathartic in a weird way. One more personal moment, I found myself thinking about how exhausting it must be to be Ella after this. Not just physically, smoke, fear, whatever injuries, but emotionally. Imagine surviving that and then having to explain it. Having to convince people you're not being dramatic. Having to make a legal decision with your hands still shaking. Survival doesn't end when you're out of the room. It just changes shape. And Leah, too, imagine the anger. The kind of anger that makes your whole body hot, like you're the one on fire. Because she didn't just see Ella suffer, she saw the husbands fail. That's a very specific kind of disillusionment. It's not heartbreak over your own relationship only, it's disgust at the moral character of people you trusted as family. If the show gives Leah a scene, again, hypothetically, where she's alone and the rage finally hits, it could be powerful. Not a glamorous rage, but the ugly kind, trembling hands, shallow breath, the realization that you were never protected by the men you thought would protect you. That's a universal emotional beat even when the plot is heightened. Now let's talk about why filing for divorce together is such a narrative mic drop. It's not only solidarity, it's optics. It's two women controlling the story before it gets controlled for them. Because imagine if only Ella filed. The family could paint her as unstable after trauma, like she's making rash decisions. If only Leah filed, they could say she's jealous or meddling. Together, they create a pattern that's harder to dismiss. Two separate marriages, same family, same outcome. That's evidence in the court of public opinion, even if no court is involved. But there's a flip side, doing it together also means their journeys might get tied in a way that feels restrictive. If one wants to pause, does she feel guilty? If one wavers, does it risk pulling the other back in? That's where the friendship can be tested, not by lack of love, but by difference in pace. Another rehook, what happens when, together, stops being empowering and starts feeling like a promise you can't afford to break? That's why, if I were writing this, I'd want at least some moments where Ella and Leah disagree, not in a dramatic betrayal way, but in a real way. Like, I can't do it today. I'm scared. I miss him. Don't say that. That kind of friction makes the bond believable. It also prevents the friendship from turning into a perfect moral refuge. The point isn't that women are flawless together, the point is that this friendship is real enough to hold weight. Now, on the men's side, the story can explore a very particular brand of entitlement, the belief that a wife's pain is negotiable. Charles choosing the cat implies he believes Ella can wait. That her fear is not urgent. Noah mocking implies he believes Leah's panic is silly. That she is not a reliable narrator of her own experience. Those are entitlement beliefs. And the divorce decision is the women saying, "You don't get to negotiate my survival." Visually, the show can keep echoing the fire even after it's gone. Smoke stains. Soot marks. The smell that doesn't wash out. Even if they never show it literally again, they can imply it with color grading, slightly desaturated scenes, grayish shadows, a muted palette during marriage moments. Then, as the women reclaim themselves, maybe the palette warms in a different way, not romantic warmth, but a live warmth. There's a huge difference between warm like a lie and warm like a sunrise. If the cinematography team knows that, they can make the emotional arc feel physical. Sound can do that too. Silence can become a weapon. After mockery, there's often a quiet that feels like humiliation settling. A drama that uses silence strategically, letting a beat linger after a cruel line, letting us sit with Leah's stunned face after Noah laughs, can make the cruelty land harder than any shouted argument. And acting again, this kind of story rises and falls on the women's performances. Not because women suffering equals awards, but because the story requires internal shifts. Ella moving from pleading to resolve. Leah moving from panic to strategy. If the actresses can show those shifts without overplaying them, just a steadier gaze, a slower breath, a voice that stops asking permission, that's where the empowerment feels earned. Let me throw in a quick, self-aware humor beat before we drown in intensity. If a man chose a cat over me in a fire, I wouldn't file for divorce, I'd file for an exorcism. Like, sir, what demon are you hosting? Again, pet lovers, I'm kidding. Mostly. But you get why this premise is such instant emotional gasoline. Another rehook, the cat isn't the problem. The cat is the receipt. And receipts are what this show seems obsessed with. Here's what he did. Here's how he reacted. Here's how he treated you when it mattered. The premise is basically a stack of receipts stapled together with smoke. What I also appreciate is that the story doesn't isolate Ella's betrayal as a one-off, bad husband situation. It pairs it with Leah's experience with Noah. That parallelism makes it harder for the audience to shrug it off as, well, maybe Charles just panicked. Because Noah's mockery adds a second data point. Two brothers, two forms of cruelty. It suggests a family culture. Not genetically, not deterministically, but culturally, how they learn to treat women's emotions, how they learn to prioritize their own comfort. And that opens up the possibility of exploring generational patterns, without needing to show parents or backstory explicitly. Sometimes all you need is two adult men responding similarly to female distress for the audience to sense the pattern. Now, because we're staying light on spoilers, I'm not going to speculate about legal outcomes or custody or anything like that. What I can say is that the emotional core of any divorce narrative is grief. Even when the husband is wrong. Even when the wife is justified. You grieve the life you thought you'd have. You grieve the version of him you loved. You grieve your own years. And those grief stages can appear as anger, numbness, denial, bargaining, even sudden nostalgia that makes no sense. If Brides in Smoke allows nostalgia to exist without romanticizing the men, that's a sign of maturity. Because you can miss someone and still know they're unsafe. That contradiction is real, and dramas often flatten it into, she's strong, she doesn't care. Sometimes strength is caring and leaving anyway. Another craft challenge, keeping the ex as an active threat without letting her dominate the narrative. The premise positions her as a catalyst. If later the show leans too heavily on her as the ongoing villain, it could accidentally shift focus away from the husband's accountability. The husbands are the point. The marriages are the point. The women's awakening is the point. The ex's existence should sharpen that, not replace it. I also keep thinking about the symbolism of third anniversary. 3 years is long enough for patterns to calcify, but not so long that leaving feels impossible due to decades of shared life. It's an interesting timeline because it captures that middle zone where you've invested enough to feel ashamed of quitting, but not so much that you're fully resigned. It's the point where you still might believe you can fix it, until the fire forces the truth. Here's another rehook, because it's the kind of question that keeps a viewer glued. If Charles can abandon Ella in a burning room, what else has he abandoned her in, emotionally, when there wasn't visible smoke? That's where the phrase, years of miserable marriages, becomes so important. It's basically permission for the show to do flashback-like emotional texture without literal flashbacks. You can write dialogue that implies history. A single line like, "You always do this," can carry years if it's delivered right. An exhausted look can carry 1,000 nights of disappointment. That's the kind of acting and writing shorthand that makes a melodrama feel deep instead of messy. If the show's dialogue is sharp, it can avoid repetitive arguments. Because the danger in relationship dramas is repeating the same fight in different rooms. The way you avoid that is to make each confrontation about a different layer, one about denial, one about blame, one about apology, one about manipulation, one about consequences. Same relationship, different battleground each time. And even without seeing it, you can feel how Brides in Smoke is set up to do that. Charles' betrayal is about priority. Noah's mockery is about respect. Priority and respect are different layers. And when both are broken, love doesn't stand a chance. Let me be fair, though, the show also risks making the men so reprehensible that the women's emotional conflict becomes implausible. Viewers will say, why would they hesitate? So the writers have to ground the hesitation not in, but he's actually sweet, but in realistic traps, shame, fear, money, social pressure, trauma bonding, the sunk cost fallacy. Those are real. People stay in bad situations for real reasons. If the show portrays those reasons with empathy, it can keep the women's journey believable without softening the men's wrongdoing. Another rehook, the hardest part of leaving isn't deciding you deserve better. It's acting like you believe it. That's a theme I hope the show leans into, belief as action. Ella begging for help suggests she still believed Charles would choose her. The betrayal shatters that belief. Divorce is the act of building a new belief, I can choose myself. Leah, too, calling Noah suggests she still believed he would respond like a healer. His mockery shatters that. Divorce becomes a new oath, not to a man, but to her own instincts. Now, let's talk about the emotional manipulation a show like this can pull, and why it sometimes works on me even when I know the tricks. The fire scene is a classic high-stakes inciting incident. It's designed to hook you. But if the show is well made, the hook isn't the fire, it's the moral decision Charles makes in the shadow of the fire. That's what separates it from a cheap thriller. The story is less, will she survive, and more, what does survival mean when love failed? That's why the title's emphasis on brides matters too. This isn't just women in smoke. It's brides, women who were promised partnership, protection, mutuality. The show is interrogating the bridal fantasy. It's dragging the white dress through ash. A note on audience reaction, I can already see why some critics might call this melodrama too on the nose. And I get it. Sometimes subtlety is art. But there's also art in directness. There's art in a story that refuses to let you rationalize cruelty. In a media landscape where women's pain is constantly minimized, a drama that says, no, this is what it is, can be oddly refreshing. Also, the premise's decision to have both women leave together is an inherently hopeful statement. It's saying you don't have to leave alone. And that's not always true in real life, some people don't have a Leah. But as a story, it's aspirational in a way that doesn't feel fake to me. It feels like a love letter to female friendship as a survival tool. Here's another rehook, if the friendship is the love story, what does that mean for how we evaluate the marriages? Are the husbands even the main characters of their own downfall, or are they just obstacles on the women's road back to themselves? That's a framing choice. If Brides in Smoke keeps the camera emotionally centered on Ella and Leah, the men become less interesting as romantic leads and more interesting as case studies in entitlement. That can be satisfying for viewers who are tired of bad men getting redemption arcs. But it can also frustrate viewers who want complexity from everyone. The show has to choose its priorities. And I'll say it plainly, I don't need Charles and Noah to be complex in a sympathetic way. I need them to be complex in a believable way. There's a difference. A believable man can be cruel and still have moments of charm. A believable man can love in his own broken way and still be harmful. If the show can balance that, showing how someone can be both nice sometimes and still unsafe, that's the kind of complexity that matters. Now, about pacing again, after a big inciting incident, the show needs smaller hooks. Not twists, hooks. Emotional questions. One of the best hooks a divorce drama can use is, will she break and go back? Not because we want her to, but because we understand how hard leaving is. Another hook is, will the friendship survive the strain? Another is, will the women be believed? Those are all stakes that don't require new villains, just human weakness and social pressure. Also, visually, I'd love if the show uses recurring motifs, doors, locks, keys. Ella being locked in a burning room is a literal lock. Divorce is a legal unlocking. Freedom is getting your keys back. Again, I'm not saying the show does this, I'm saying it's sitting right there, begging to be used. And if the show is really clever, it could flip the locked room motif later in an emotional way, the women choosing to lock the men out, metaphorically. Choosing silence. Choosing no contact. Choosing not to engage with manipulation. That's the kind of symbolic echo that makes a melodrama feel cohesive. Let me give one more performance-specific thought, because it's something I always watch in dramas about betrayal, the moment after a cruel act, when the victim stops crying. There's a specific kind of calm that can appear. It's not peace. It's shock turning into clarity. If Ella has that moment, if Leah has that moment, the actresses need to play it like the emotional oxygen has been sucked out of the room. It's almost numb. It's almost quiet. And it's terrifying, because it signals the relationship has crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. Another rehook, the scariest thing for a man who relies on your forgiveness is the day you stop arguing. That's why mockery is such a stupid choice for Noah, emotionally speaking. Mockery is a power play. It's designed to make the other person small. But it also trains the other person to detach. And detachment is death for a relationship. A lot of people think anger kills love. It's not anger. It's indifference. Mockery accelerates indifference. Now, I'm going to touch on the moral landscape again, because there's an ethical tightrope in using pregnancy, baby stakes. The premise says Noah is called to save Ella and her baby. That implies urgency and vulnerability. The show has to avoid turning this into, the baby is why it matters. Because it already matters. Ella matters. Leah matters. Their pain matters. If the show uses the baby to get the audience to care, that's manipulative. If it uses the baby to underline the men's cruelty, like, even then, they mocked, that's thematically consistent. And if you want to be really honest, the baby also adds a dimension of inherited consequence. When you choose a partner who is dismissive and contemptuous, you're not just choosing for yourself, you're choosing the environment a child will grow up in. That realization can be a powerful motivator for leaving. But again, I hope it's not the only motivator, because women deserve autonomy beyond motherhood. Okay, quick comedic aside again because we need air. Charles, buddy, as a firefighter, you literally have one brand. 1. I save people from fires. If you can't do it in your own home, please return the brand to the store. Receipt required. Alright, back to the emotional devastation. The show's title also hints at spectacle. Smoke looks cinematic. Fire looks cinematic. And that's another risk, that the show becomes more interested in spectacle than intimacy. The burning room could be shot like an action sequence, but the real power is in the faces. In the choices. In the delays. If the director understands that, the fire isn't the highlight, it's the backdrop for moral collapse. Another rehook, What if the most important rescue in Brides in Smoke isn't Leah running into the fire, but Leah refusing to let Ella rewrite what happened to make Charles look better? Because that's something friends do in real life. When you're trapped in a bad relationship, they hold the line of reality. They say, no, that was not okay. And that can be harder than rescuing someone physically, because it means you might be the bad guy in their story for a while. You might be the friend who doesn't understand. You might be the one who hates him. But you keep holding the truth until they can hold it too. If Leah is written as that kind of friend, she's not just heroic, she's emotionally brave. And Ella, if she's written with realism, might resist that truth at first. She might defend Charles out of habit. She might minimize out of shame. Watching that push-pull, again, if the show chooses to depict it, could be some of the strongest material. Now, in terms of dialogue strategy, I hope the show avoids villain monologues. It doesn't need Charles to explain why the cat mattered. It doesn't need Noah to justify mockery in a speech. What it needs is the sickening casualness of those choices. The banality. The little shrug. The "I thought you'd be fine." Because that's how these betrayals happen in life, not with speeches, but with dismissals. And the women's dialogue, too, should ideally evolve. Early on, in miserable marriages, women often speak in softened language. They apologize before asking. They say, "It's fine," when it's not. After the betrayal, that language can shift. Sentences become shorter. Fewer smiles. Less emotional labor. That's a subtle arc that actresses can sell with timing alone. Another rehook, watch how often a character says, "sorry." In stories like this, that word is basically a barometer of self-worth. I'm also thinking about the kind of viewers this drama will attract. Some people come for catharsis, the satisfaction of seeing women choose divorce and reclaim power. Some people come for outrage, the "I can't believe he did that" adrenaline. Some people come because they recognize the emotional patterns and want to feel seen. A drama like this has to feed all those appetites without losing its spine. If it leans too hard into catharsis, it becomes shallow empowerment. If it leans too hard into outrage, it becomes exhausting. If it leans too hard into realism, it might undercut the melodramatic hook. The sweet spot is emotional truth with heightened storytelling. The premise suggests that's what it's aiming for, but execution is everything. One more thematic layer, the idea of first love as a haunting. Charles' first love isn't just a person from the past, she represents the life he might secretly still prioritize over the marriage. Even if he claims he doesn't. And Charles choosing the cat is almost like choosing the past over the present in a grotesquely symbolic way. It's the past's needs, no matter how trivial, outweighing the present wife's life. That's a really sharp metaphor for relationships where a partner never fully arrives. Where you're married to someone who is physically there but emotionally tethered elsewhere, to an ex, to a parent, to their job, to their ego. Brides in Smoke takes that emotional tether and yanks it into the open. Another rehook, the fire is loud, but the real question is what happens after the smoke clears. Does Charles even understand what he did, or does he only understand that he's being punished? Because that distinction separates remorse from self-pity. And self-pity is the enemy of accountability. Now, I want to talk about the Together divorce decision as a narrative tool again, because it creates something really satisfying, mirrored scenes. Again, I'm not inventing them, but the structure invites them. Ella and Leah could have parallel moments of realization. Parallel moments of packing. Parallel moments of confronting. Parallel moments of breaking down. That kind of mirroring can make the story feel like a duet, not two separate arcs glued together. And a duet story is only as good as the chemistry between the leads. Best friend chemistry is not the same as romantic chemistry. It's softer, but deeper. It's eye contact that feels like home. It's physical closeness that's casual, not charged. It's the way one person reaches for the other's hand without making it a moment. If the actresses nail that, the show will have an emotional anchor strong enough to carry even the most ridiculous plot spikes. Here's another rehook: if Ella and Leah are the true love story, does the show ever let them be happy together, or is their bond only portrayed through suffering? That's a key question, because a lot of dramas accidentally portray female friendship as nothing but trauma support. Real friendship has joy, pettiness, laughter, boredom, comfort. If Brides in Smoke gives them even small moments of levity, again, without undercutting the seriousness, it will make the suffering feel less exploitative and more like part of a full life. And I want that, because otherwise the story becomes a tunnel with no air. Now, I'm going to shift into a slightly more craft-critical mode for a few paragraphs, because mixed stance means I'm allowed to be picky. The premise is so strong that it could tempt the writers to rely on it. Like, Remember the Fire, becomes a crutch. A good script uses the inciting incident as a wound that informs later choices, not as a constant flashback button. If every argument circles back to the burning room, the story can feel stuck. The show needs to widen the lens. The burning room is the proof, but the issue is bigger: respect, loyalty, credibility, safety. Another possible writing pitfall: making the women's decision to divorce too clean, too instantly righteous. Real divorce decisions, even in justified situations, can be messy. You might still love them. You might still fear being alone. You might still worry about money, reputation, family. If the show skips those messy feelings, it becomes fantasy. And fantasy can be fun, but it won't hit as hard as truth. And here's my contrarian mini-defense again: some fantasy is okay, actually, if it's purposeful. A synchronized divorce is, in a way, a fantasy of solidarity. But it's a fantasy that addresses a real pain: women being isolated and picked off one by one. So even if it's heightened, it's emotionally meaningful. Another rehook: the fantasy isn't divorce is easy. The fantasy is you don't have to do it alone. That's why the show's emotional success depends on whether it keeps centering the women's interiority. If it starts focusing too much on the brothers' reactions, it can slide into, look how sad the men are. And I'm sorry, but if you ignore your wife in a burning room and mock a rescue call, your sadness is not the story I'm most interested in. Your sadness can exist, but it's not the camera's home. Okay, now let's talk about the Harper brothers as a unit. Brothers often have a shared language. They cover for each other. They normalize each other's behavior. The premise doesn't explicitly say they do that, but it's a natural tension point. If Charles minimizes what he did, Noah might validate that minimization. If Noah mocks Leah, Charles might shrug it off. That mutual reinforcement can be the true antagonist, not one man, but a system of male solidarity that protects them from consequences. And if the women divorce together, they create a counter-solidarity. That's the story's structural elegance. Two alliances collide. Another rehook: which alliance is stronger, blood brothers or chosen sisters? From a production standpoint, if this drama has decent budget, the fire sequence could be genuinely intense, but I hope it doesn't blow the whole budget emotionally in one place. Sometimes low-budget dramas are better at intimacy because they can't rely on spectacle. They have to rely on faces, dialogue, quiet cruelty. And honestly, that's where this story lives. The fire is the spark. The real burn is the years. I also want to talk about mockery again, because it's such a specific cruelty. Mockery doesn't just hurt, it humiliates. It tells you your feelings are entertainment. And humiliation is the emotion that makes people go silent afterward. It makes them stop reaching out. So Noah's mockery isn't just a bad moment, it's a relationship-killing event that also potentially endangers Ella if medical help is delayed or dismissed. That detail in the premise is doing a lot of moral work. If the show is serious about moral accountability, it won't let that be brushed off as, he didn't realize. It will treat it as a character reveal. Noah's default response to Leah's urgency is to make her small. That's a worldview, not a mistake. Another rehook: a man who mocks you in an emergency will mock you in every quiet crisis too: grief, anxiety, postpartum fear, anything inconvenient. And yes, I'm aware I'm projecting possible scenarios. I'm doing it carefully, because I'm not claiming the show depicts them. I'm saying the premise implies a pattern that would logically extend into other areas of life. That's what makes it so unsettling. It's not just one scene. It's a marriage philosophy. Now, I want to pull back and talk about why viewers love divorce dramas. It's not because people enjoy paperwork. It's because divorce stories externalize an internal battle, the battle between who you were taught to be, loyal, accommodating, forgiving, and who you need to become to survive, assertive, self-trusting, boundary-driven. Brides in Smoke sets that battle up with a literal survival scenario. It's basically saying, accommodation can kill you. That's a strong message. It's also a potentially triggering one, depending on viewers' experiences. So I hope the show handles the emotional aftermath with care, not just intensity. Another rehook: do Ella and Leah file for divorce out of rage, or out of clarity? Rage is combustible. Clarity is sustainable. The difference matters. Because rage can fade. Clarity becomes a new identity. The best divorce dramas show the shift from rage to clarity. The rage gets you moving. The clarity keeps you from going back. If Brides in Smoke tracks that, Ella and Leah going from, "How could you," to, "I know exactly who you are," it will feel satisfying. Also, the phrase, heartbroken and betrayed, in the premise suggests grief is present, not just anger. That's good. Heartbreak means there was hope once. It means leaving isn't just winning, it's mourning. Stories that acknowledge mourning feel less like revenge fantasy and more like healing narrative. I'm going to keep it real, I'm a little wary of how some shows handle best friends, because they sometimes turn the friendship into a plot machine rather than a relationship. Like, the friend exists only to give pep talks. But the premise here gives Leah an active role: she rescues, she calls, she's in the thick of it. That's already a better foundation. Leah isn't a cheerleader, she's a co-protagonist. Another rehook: if Leah is brave enough to run into fire for Ella, is she brave enough to face her own marriage truth without hiding behind Ella's crisis? That's an important question because it's easy, psychologically, to focus on your friend's problem so you don't have to look at your own. The premise says Leah is heartbroken and betrayed too, and she chooses divorce too, so the story is promising she will face it. But the emotional complexity of how she faces it, whether she tries to be the strong one, whether she cracks later, that's where her arc can become really compelling. Now, because the user asked for final part, I'm continuing seamlessly, but we're not allowed to wrap up yet anyway. So let's keep drilling into what this drama is doing structurally. The inciting incident is an intersection of three relationships: Charles and Ella as husband-wife, Charles, an ex as unresolved past, and Ella Leah as best friends. And then Noah enters through Leah's call. That's a beautifully efficient web. You don't need 10 side plots to create intensity. You have one crisis that touches every bond. That's good melodrama design. And it also creates a moral map. Leah is the moral center in that moment, she acts. Ella is the emotional center, she suffers and realizes. Charles and Noah reveal their moral failures. The ex is the catalyst of danger. It's a tight map. The show's challenge is to keep that map from becoming static. Another rehook: once everyone's role is revealed in the fire, how does the show keep surprising us without contradicting what we've learned? Surprise doesn't have to mean twist. It can mean depth. It can mean seeing a character behave consistently in a new context. For example, a dismissive man might become suddenly generous if it protects his image. A mocking man might become sweet if it buys him time. Those are consistent behaviors, self-serving, not contradictions. If the show uses that kind of consistent surprise, it can stay engaging without inventing wild plot. And again, I'm not claiming it does. I'm laying out the kind of storytelling logic the premise supports. Let's also touch on the gender politics of first love. In a lot of stories, men's first love is treated as sacred, this nostalgic ideal they never fully let go of, and women are expected to tolerate that haunting. Brides in Smoke flips that into a horror scenario. The first love isn't a wistful memory, she's a literal danger. That's the show refusing to romanticize the "she was my first love" excuse. It's saying, nostalgia can be toxic. Unresolved past can burn down present lives. That's a bold statement, and I kind of love it. Another rehook: How many times have we seen men use history as an excuse for disrespect? This drama takes that excuse and sets it on fire. Okay, I'll stop punning about fire before I become my own villain here. But you get it, the symbolism is strong. From an audience perspective, one of the pleasures of this kind of story is watching women stop negotiating. Watching them stop performing cool girl or understanding wife. But the writers have to be careful not to make the women's new assertiveness into a personality transplant. They don't become different people overnight. They become themselves, louder. If the actresses can show that, the same softness, the same humor, but with new boundaries, then the empowerment feels grounded. If they suddenly become icy one-liner machines, it might feel satisfying in edits but less satisfying as drama. Another rehook, the goal isn't to become hard. The goal is to become free. Now, I want to talk about the word, betrayed, because betrayal implies expectation. Ella expects Charles to save her. Leah expects Noah to help. Those expectations aren't unreasonable, they are literally built into marriage and into their professions. So the betrayal isn't, I hoped you'd do something extra. It's, I expected you'd do the minimum of love and you refused. That's why this premise is so rage-inducing. The men aren't failing at perfection. They are failing at baseline humanity. And that's also why the drama's moral clarity is so sharp. You don't have to be a relationship expert to know that ignoring your wife in a fire is wrong. You don't have to be a medical expert to know mocking someone calling for urgent help is wrong. The show doesn't require niche understanding. It requires empathy. Another rehook, when a story has moral clarity this strong, the only way to keep it interesting is to explore the psychology of how people still rationalize the irrational. Because they will. People always do. That's what makes the men potentially compelling even as antagonists, not their pain, but their justifications. The way they twist reality to avoid consequence. The way they rewrite the story to preserve self-image. If Brides in Smoke captures that convincingly, it will feel uncomfortably real. Alright, I'm going to pause on a natural thought boundary here while staying inside the flow, because the next thing I want to dig into is how the show can visually and emotionally separate fire as event from smoke as life, and how the divorce choice can be portrayed not as a single triumphant moment but as a long, grinding reclaiming of identity that tests both women in different ways, because getting out isn't one clean leap, it's a series of smaller exits that all cost something. And if Brides in Smoke understands that, it'll treat the burning room like the inciting flare, and the smoke like the long-term environment, this residue that clings to their lungs and their decisions long after the flames are gone. Smoke is what makes you cough at night. Smoke is what makes you second-guess whether you can breathe in your own home. Smoke is what turns ordinary moments, closing a door, hearing a siren, smelling something singe, into a flash of panic you didn't invite. What I mean is, the show can do something really effective without adding any new, big events. It can make the aftermath tactile. And that's not just writing, that's production choices. Color grading that stays slightly ashen in the Harper spaces. Lighting that makes rooms feel airless even when they are technically normal. A sound bed that occasionally brings back a faint crackle or a distant alarm when Ella is alone with her thoughts. Not in a cheesy, trauma montage way, more like a subtle nervous system echo. If the creators are paying attention, you don't need someone to say, I'm traumatized. You see it in the way she pauses before turning a handle. And then the divorce decision, again, staying within what the premise gives us, should feel like a reclaiming of oxygen. Not suddenly, I'm healed, but I can finally inhale without asking permission. A lot of dramas confuse the act of leaving with the feeling of freedom. Those are different. Leaving is logistics and fear. Freedom is what you earn later, after you survive the backlash and the loneliness and the late-night doubt. Here's a rehook that I think is essential to keeping this story alive beyond the initial shock. After years of being minimized, can Ella and Leah actually trust their own instincts again, or do they keep looking for someone, anyone, to validate what they already know? Because that's the slippery thing about dismissal and mockery. It trains you to outsource your reality. You start needing witnesses for your feelings. And the tragedy is, even when you finally leave, you may still feel like you need permission. So the divorce becomes not just, I'm done with you, but, I'm done asking you to agree that I'm hurt. One of the most interesting angles in Brides in Smoke is that the men's betrayals are different textures of the same underlying disrespect. Charles' failure is physical and immediate, he doesn't move toward her danger. Noah's failure is verbal and psychological, he laughs at danger being reported. If the show is sharp, it won't treat those as separate problems. It'll show they come from the same root assumption, women's urgency is negotiable. And for newcomers to this kind of drama, that's where a lot of the tension comes from. It's not just, bad things happen. It's, bad things happen, and then the people responsible insist they didn't. That insistence is a second violence. It's the part that can drive you insane as a viewer. Because you're watching someone twist reality right in front of the character's face. Now, I'm going to make a craft argument that might sound picky, but it matters. The show's best weapon is restraint after the big betrayal. Not emotional restraint, this should be emotionally loud. I mean narrative restraint. Don't pile on 3 more catastrophes to keep viewers engaged. Let the betrayal breathe. Let it rot the relationships from the inside out. Let the women's decision to divorce feel like the natural result of truth finally being unhidden. A good melodrama doesn't need constant fireworks, it needs constant pressure. Here's another rehook, if the husband's worst moments are so clear, where does the suspense come from? It comes from the women's internal tug-of-war, not from us doubting who's right. That's the difference between a morality play and a psychological drama. This premise gives you moral clarity, the work is making the psychology messy and real without making the morality blurry. If I were watching this unfold on screen, I'd be paying attention to how the show frames Ella's face when Charles brushes her off. Because brushing off is such a specific kind of cruelty, it's dismissive, impatient, almost bored. It's not a punch. It's a shrug. And in relationships, the shrug is often more devastating than the scream, because it tells you you're not even worth anger. You're worth inconvenience. An actor playing Charles could make that moment horrifying in a very simple way, not by shouting, not by panicking, but by sounding mildly annoyed, like Ella is interrupting something. That's the tone that makes a viewer's stomach drop. And then the show can complicate it later, again, not by excusing it, but by showing how someone like Charles rationalizes that tone as, I was stressed. Stress doesn't create contempt, though. It reveals it. Noah's mockery is similar. If it's written as a big, obvious laugh, it's easy to hate but hard to believe. If it's written as a small, reflexive chuckle, like, come on, Leah, that's the kind of cruelty people dismiss as, just joking. And that's what makes it dangerous. It's deniable. It's socially slippery. It gives Noah a built-in escape hatch, I didn't mean it like that. Meanwhile, Leah is left holding the humiliation. Here's a rehook that keeps the tension sharp. What happens when the men insist the women are overreacting, and the women start wondering if they are, despite what we, the audience, clearly saw? That's where a drama like this can either get painfully accurate or accidentally irritating. Painfully accurate if it portrays that self-doubt with empathy and precision. Irritating if it drags it out just to delay the divorce. The line between authentic wobble and plot stalling is thin. Pacing-wise, the story needs emotional escalations that aren't external disasters. Those escalations can be subtle. A conversation where someone finally says the word divorce out loud. A moment where Leah stops cushioning her language for Noah. A moment where Ella doesn't answer Charles' call. Tiny actions that would have been unthinkable before. Those are the steps that feel like character growth rather than plot movement. And because the premise centers 2 women doing this together, the show can build a rhythm where their choices alternate and echo. Ella is the first to break emotionally, Leah holds her up. Later, Leah breaks, Ella holds her up. That kind of mutuality is what makes the friendship feel like a relationship, not a rescue mission. If it becomes one-sided, Leah always saving, Ella always suffering, it risks turning Leah into a tool rather than a person. Here's a little personal confession that I didn't expect to have with this premise. Stories where best friends do life together make me weirdly emotional, because it's the kind of love our culture undervalues. We glorify romance, but friendship is often the love that actually lasts. So seeing a premise that essentially says, their marriage is ash, but their friendship is oxygen, hits me in a soft spot. I want the show to honor that without turning it into a saintly bond that never strains. Because strain is real. If Leah rushes into danger for Ella, part of her might later think, in a quiet ugly moment, why did I have to? Not because she regrets saving her friend, but because she's furious at the men who made her have to. That anger can spill sideways. It can make Leah impatient with Ella's lingering attachment. It can make Ella feel guilty for needing rescue. Those are human reactions. If the show allows them, the friendship becomes more believable, not less. Here's a rehook: the friendship doesn't have to be perfect to be powerful, but it does have to be honest. Another thing the premise sets up, without needing any extra plot facts, is the issue of credibility when you're a woman reporting harm caused by a respected man. Imagine trying to explain the fire event to anyone in the Harper orbit. A firefighter's colleagues might instinctively defend him. People might say, he would never leave someone behind. That reflex can make Ella feel like she's arguing against an entire institution, not just a husband. Noah being a doctor adds the same social armor. People assume doctors are logical, responsible, altruistic. So Leah being mocked by him could be dismissed as, he was stressed, he was on shift, he didn't know. The show could make that institutional pressure part of the smoke. Not in a preachy way, just in small social exchanges where the women realize the world is set up to doubt them. That's where the divorce decision becomes even braver, because it's not just leaving a man, it's leaving a narrative that everyone else wants to maintain. From a filmmaking standpoint, one of the smartest ways to portray that is through staging. Put Ella and Leah physically smaller in group scenes. Have people talk over them. Have the camera linger a second too long on their faces while others laugh and minimize. It doesn't have to be overt. It just has to feel like air being taken out of the room. Here's a rehook that shifts the focus slightly. In a world that keeps telling you you're exaggerating, what does it take to say no and mean it? I also want to talk about the word baby in the premise, because it adds a very specific emotional weapon to the story, the idea that Ella's life is not the only thing at stake. This can intensify viewer rage. But it can also deepen Ella's internal conflict. Motherhood can sharpen your boundaries or blur them. It can make you leave to protect your child, or it can make you stay because you fear instability. Either direction is believable. The show's job would be to portray whichever path it takes with respect, not judgment. And if the show is careful, it won't frame Ella as brave because she's a mother. It'll frame her as brave because she's a person who deserves safety. Motherhood can be part of the stakes, not the justification for her humanity. Here's a rehook: is the baby a symbol of future freedom, or a chain the men try to use to keep her close? Because that's a real dynamic in divorce stories, children becoming leverage. Again, I'm not saying the show does this. I'm saying the premise gives it the potential, and if it chooses to go there, it needs to do it responsibly. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, the ex. A first love returning is a classic trope. What makes it potentially interesting here isn't romance jealousy, it's moral threat. Locking Ella in a burning room is the kind of act that can swallow the narrative if the show isn't careful. It could turn into, stop the ex, rather than, leave the husbands. So the writers need to keep the ex as the spark, not the center. One way to do that is to make sure every time the ex is mentioned, the story returns to the husband's choice. It's not, she did it. It's, he didn't save her. That's the line. If the show holds that line, it stays thematically coherent. If it lets the men hide behind, my ex is crazy, it becomes a different, weaker story. Here's another rehook: if Charles blames his ex, is that accountability, or just outsourcing guilt? Now, about the show's emotional manipulation, because every melodrama manipulates you a little, that's part of the genre. Brides in Smoke, by premise alone, is designed to trigger protective instincts. That's fine. The question is whether it earns that reaction or just exploits it. The earning comes from characterization and consequence. Do the women change in believable ways? Do the men face believable fallout? Does the story acknowledge the messy grief, or does it sprint to revenge? And this is where I'll be a little sharp. If the show turns the divorce into a glam empowerment montage without showing the ugly parts, panic attacks, self-doubt, social backlash, it'll feel like it wants the aesthetic of survival without the reality of it. That's the kind of thing that looks great in clips and feels thin in full episodes. But if it takes its time with the emotional digestion, it can be genuinely affecting. Here's a re-hook: the fire is the hook, but the divorce is the promise. Does the show fulfill the promise, or just keep dangling it? Because the premise ends at, they decide to file for divorce together. That's the pivot. The story after that is where the show either becomes a slow burn character study or a repetitive cycle of arguments. And this is where performance and writing have to do the heavy lifting. One thing I always look for in divorce narratives is how the characters' speech patterns change. People who have been minimized tend to over-explain. They give evidence. They list reasons. They plead for understanding. As they grow, they explain less. They stop presenting their pain like it's a legal case. They start stating boundaries like facts. That's a subtle but powerful arc that actors can communicate with pacing and breath. Imagine Ella in early scenes, voice trembling, trying to keep it polite even when she's dying. Then imagine Ella later, saying something simple like, "I'm done," with no tremble. The difference isn't volume. It's certainty. That certainty is the real catharsis. Here's a small humorous aside that fits right into that. The day a woman stops writing footnotes for her feelings is the day a man like Noah starts panicking. Because he can't debate a boundary that isn't a debate. He can only accept it, or lose access. Here's a rehook: what do men like Charles and Noah do when the women stop negotiating? That's when you see who they really are. Now, let's talk about the on-camera voice vibe of this show, how it might feel as a viewer. Brides in Smoke seems like the kind of drama where you're constantly leaning forward, not because of mystery, but because you're waiting for the characters to say the thing you've been screaming. He didn't choose you. He laughed at you. That's not love. It's a say-it-out-loud drama. Those are addictive when done right, because they create a shared language for pain. But there's also a risk: say-it-out-loud dramas can become didactic. Characters start speaking in slogans. Therapy speak takes over. Everything becomes a quote. If that happens, it undercuts the rawness. The best versions keep it messy. People don't always say the perfect line at the perfect time. Sometimes they say the wrong thing and regret it. Sometimes they go quiet. Sometimes they laugh at the wrong moment because their brain can't hold the horror. If Brides in Smoke includes even one moment of inappropriate laughter, like a character laughing because the cat detail is so absurd it breaks their brain, that would actually feel real. Trauma can do that. It can make you laugh because the alternative is screaming. Here's a rehook: does the show allow ugly emotions, pettiness, shame, numbness, or does it keep everything neatly righteous? Because neat righteousness is satisfying but not always honest. I also want to talk about how the show could handle the Harper brothers' relationship with each other. Brothers can be mirrors. They can be accomplices. They can also be competitors. The premise doesn't specify their dynamic, so I won't invent it. But it's an opportunity. If Charles and Noah reinforce each other's worldview, the women are up against a united front. If the brothers crack under pressure, one blaming the other, one refusing accountability while the other tries to maintain image, that could add tension without adding new characters or plot. The brothers themselves can become a pressure system. And from a performance standpoint, that's juicy. Two men who are used to being admired, firefighter, doctor, suddenly being confronted with moral failure. Their defensiveness could be played in so many ways: wounded pride, rage, fake remorse, cold denial. If the actors avoid melodramatic snarling and instead go for defensive sincerity, "I didn't mean it," it becomes more unsettling, because it mirrors how harmful people often speak in real life. Here's a rehook: the most infuriating apology is the one that demands forgiveness while refusing responsibility. Now, because this is a YouTube review script and not a scene-by-scene recap, I want to keep weaving craft talk with emotional response. So let's touch on staging and camera again, specifically for the rescue sequence. A key choice is perspective. If the show shoots it from Ella's point of view, it becomes claustrophobic terror. If it shoots it from Leah's point of view, it becomes frantic determination. If it shoots it from Charles's point of view, it becomes moral indictment, because we're watching him choose. The most effective version might alternate Ella's terror, Leah's urgency, Charles's failure. Each cut becomes a moral argument. And the sound mix can underline whose reality the show prioritizes. If Ella's breaths are loud in the mix, we're inside her body. If Charles's voice is crisp and calm, we feel the disconnect. If Leah's footsteps and ragged inhale dominate, we feel her courage. Those choices matter. They shape how we interpret the characters, even without dialogue. Here's a rehook: who does the camera love? Who does it believe? In stories like this, that's everything. Because camera sympathy is real. If the show keeps returning to the men's suffering with swelling music, it's nudging the audience toward forgiveness. If it stays with the women's aftermath, quiet shaking, disorientation, rage, it's nudging toward accountability. Neither is inherently wrong, but it determines what kind of story Brides in Smoke is trying to be. My hope, based on the premise's boldness, is that it's an accountability-forward story. Not revenge, not hatred, but accountability. You did this, and it has consequences, and we're not dressing it up. Now, quick note for newcomers who might be wary. Yes, this premise is intense, and yes, it can be frustrating to watch men behave this way. But that frustration can also be the point. Sometimes dramas like this aren't meant to be enjoyable in the cozy sense. They are meant to be activating. They are meant to make you feel your own boundaries. To remind you that love without safety is not love worth keeping. Here's a rehook that brings us back to the heart. If Ella and Leah have survived years of misery, what does happiness even look like for them now? Can they imagine it? Because leaving a bad marriage doesn't automatically give you a vision of a good life. Sometimes all you know is what you don't want. And the show can make that uncertainty part of the journey, again, without inventing new disasters. Just the quiet terror of starting over. One of the strongest possible scenes in a drama like this, staying generalized, because I'm not claiming specifics, would be something very simple: Ella and Leah sitting somewhere neutral, not the Harper space, just sitting, and realizing they don't have to whisper. They don't have to manage a man's mood. They can speak plainly. And at first that freedom feels weird, like walking without a weight you've carried so long you forgot it was there. That's the kind of understated moment that can hit harder than any screaming match. And if the actresses can play that, just a small, disbelieving smile, a teary laugh, quiet, "we're really doing this," that's where the show earns the titles, Smoke, Leah. Because you're watching them step out of haze into air. Here's a rehook: the big betrayal is obvious. The subtle victory is the first time they feel light again. Now, I'm going to stop at a clean breath point in the analysis flow while staying fully inside the script voice, because there's still a lot more to unpack, especially around how the show can keep its tension high with light spoilers, by focusing on moral psychology, how it can avoid turning the ex into a scapegoat, and how it can portray divorce not as a mic drop but as a series of identity negotiations that keep biting long after the fire is out.